সবাইকে রাষ্ট্রবিজ্ঞান ট্যালেন্টের আলোচনায় স্বাগত। আজকের এই আলোচনা মূলত ইংরেজিতে আমাদের কমন সেন্স এন্ড অফ ইন কলোনিয়াল সাউথ ইন্ডিয়া আলোচক আর আজকে আমাদের এই আলোচনা রয়েছে ডক্টর বাসু, ফরমার প্রফেসর
সমীরণ, তোমার কথাগুলো কেটে কেটে যাচ্ছে একদম।
আচ্ছা, সকলকে শুভ সন্ধ্যা। রাষ্ট্রবিজ্ঞান চর্চা কেন্দ্রের পক্ষ থেকে আজকের বিশেষ আলোচনা সভা। তো আজকে আমাদের সাথে আছেন প্রফেসর প্রদীপ বাসু স্যার এবং জেএনইউ থেকে খ্রিস্টানু ডোস স্যার, a national level webinar on common sense and discourse of liberty and colonial South India. আমি প্রফেসর প্রদীপ বাসু স্যারকে চেয়ার করার জন্য অনুরোধ করছি। স্যার প্লিজ।
থ্যাংক ইউ ভেরি মাচ। নমস্কার, আদাব, good evening to everybody. I welcome Professor Christhu DOS. Is my pronunciation correct?
Absolutely, ekdam bhalo.
Acha, thank you. So we thank Rashtrobigyan Chorcha Kendro, that means Political Science Study Center. Let me tell you a few lines about this organization. This is a non-party purely academic platform, and it started since COVID-19. They are around more than 3 years. They have been doing these academic activities. There are now more than 400 webinars and seminars, both. They mostly conduct in Bangla language, that is Bengali, but several scholars who choose to speak in English, they are also welcome, and they have spoken in large numbers here. Now there are around 10,000 members, mostly in West Bengal. Throughout West Bengal, the membership spreads, but also outside West Bengal, there are many others in different parts of India, and some people are from abroad. And they are not only doing the academic seminars or webinars, they are also helping the poor children, poor students in remote village areas. They conduct free study circles, coaching centers for different exams, including NET, and they also give financial help, give free books and other articles of education. So they are doing a great job, and the main organizers are Advocate Prakash Chakraborty and Professor Shomiram Das, and many other people are also attached to this organization. I am grateful to them that they often invite me to chair the sessions. Let me introduce you our guest speaker, Professor Christhu DOS. He is in Jawaharlal Nehru University, an assistant professor in history in the Center for Historical Studies, School of Social Sciences. He has done his PhD from JNU, and his areas of interest are modern South Asian history with a special focus on social, cultural, and intellectual history of modern India, connected histories of politics, power, and proselytization in colonial India, studies on Sanatan Dharma, Mahatma Gandhi, RSS, and Hindutva. He has several awards to his credit, and there are several peer-reviewed publications. Let me mention some recent publications: Ambivalent Egalitarians, Pietists, and the Pedagogy of the Pariah in Modern South India during the 19th century. Then Gandhiji and RSS, the cultural grounding of social representations. Then colonialism and communalism, religion and changing identities in modern India. And then India after the 1857 revolt, decolonizing the mind. There are books and journals, articles, several research papers presented in national and international conferences and symposia. Today's topic is common sense and discourse of liberty in colonial South India. Common sense perhaps registered in our mind as Gramsci's concept of common sense, but perhaps it is a bit different, a different concept of common sense. Maybe let us hear from the speaker. And discourse of liberty, discourse is very much associated with, we know, Michel Foucault, but maybe here he is using the discourse of liberty in a slightly different sense. And it is very interesting that he will be speaking on colonial South India. And South India has become a very respectable place. Although North India has been dominating, but recently we find the tremendous intellectual and academic success of South India. So it will be very, very a great matter of dignity for us, respect and honor for us to listen one from South India. He will speak on a famous book written by Thomas Paine, the famous political philosopher Thomas Paine. The book was entitled Common Sense and it was published in 1776. I don't know much about it, but just a little bit we had to study about Thomas Paine, Common Sense. And he was born in England, Norfolk, in 1737, and he died in 1809. So you see, he left England, he came to USA, not USA, sorry, at that time it was the British colony of America, and he, the revolution and for independence from the chains of British rule was had already started, and his book Common Sense played a very crucial role. It became hugely popular and it inspired the revolution, and he attacked monarchy, he attacked traditional conservatism, and he endorsed right to liberty and freedom of the individual, independence, reason, etc. And the right to criticize the government, the right to free expression of opinion, and also a kind of secular humanism could be traced in his writings. Sometimes he is called a radical, liberal, democratic thinker. And he had to take pains also. He went to France. He published, uh, he was English born, but one of the American founding fathers, and he was a French revolutionary at the same time. And the American Crisis, this pamphlet was published during 1776 to 1783. And France, the French translation was also very popular. And the then French government was very much scared, terrified. And the English government also thought that his writings about French Revolution, which he wrote countering the arguments of Edmund Burke, the conservative philosopher, who discarded the French Revolution. But Thomas Paine took up the issue of French Revolution and opposed Edmund Burke. Anyway, there was a warrant for his arrest. Finally, he again came to America. He played a very crucial role in political affairs of America. And very interesting that Professor Doss is going to investigate into whether Thomas Paine's common sense or his views of liberty inspired people outside Europe and America or not. Whether the colony people, like Indian people, they were also inspired. From a general impression, we think that Thomas Paine was not so inspiring, influential, but particularly regarding South India, we know very little, and we are waiting for Dr. Christhu Doss about this interesting thing, whether Thomas Paine's liberty, common sense, advocacy for freedom, these were equally influential in South India also. Please, Professor Doss, start.
Thank you, Professor Pradip Basu, for giving me a very interesting platform to share my thoughts. I hope it's echoing.
Yes, please go ahead.
Is it echoing or I can go ahead?
Yeah, you go ahead. It is absolutely fine.
Okay, great. So once again, I thank you for this very interesting platform and inviting people like me to share my thoughts. So as Professor has already explained, my idea is to share what I have understood about Thomas Paine and his common sense and how it is relevant in contemporary times. And for example, as we all know, as a student of history, um, history does not deal merely with facts and figures. It has a deeper meaning. And similarly, as R.C. Majumdar would often argue, history needs to be therefore re-examined, largely to take account of new facts or new interpretations of known facts, but not certainly with a view to accommodate the policy of any political party or any political view. And it is in this context I would be using the idea of R.G. Collingwood. He says every new historian should re-examine or to rewrite history in its own way. Every new historian, therefore, should be asking new questions. And historians, therefore, need to revise the questions themselves. And it is in this context, I have 4 questions to discuss. One is, what is the relevance of Thomas Paine and his historically significant pamphlet called Common Sense? The second question is, what is the impact it created in India, politically, socially, and intellectually? And the third question that I would try to discuss is, why colonial South India and Madras presidency in particular became a center of intellectual discussion in the second half of the 19th century. And the final question that I would be exploring is, how did the free thinkers, in the name of Hindu Free Thinker Union in Madras, in the second half of the 19th century, were keen on articulating their ideas of social and religious liberty, but not political liberty. So now the question is, why Thomas Paine's pamphlet Common Sense is perceived as a book of Genesis in the world of free thinking. For example, there may be questions, political science or historians who would often ask the question, why Thomas Paine? Why not the Irish-born British thinker John Cullen? Anthony Collins is known widely for his book, A Discourse of Free Thinking, 1713. And why not George Jacob Holyoake, who coined the term secularism? Why I have picked up Thomas Paine? So it's very interesting. A free thinker and a believer in the doctrines of Thomas Paine, Samuel Brent, he said once about Thomas Paine, I quote him, "This common sense book may be called the book of Genesis, for it was the beginning. From this book spread the Declaration of Independence that not only laid the foundation of liberty in our own country, but the good of mankind throughout the world." So I think this clearly tells us why I have chosen Thomas Paine to contextualize the larger theme which I will tend to explore. And similarly, deriving largely from the idea of Thomas Paine in the 19th century, you find a series of individuals. They would identify themselves as nationalists or academics or free thinkers, particularly in India, were able to make use of this particular phrase, common sense, as a tool for critical inquiry. I'm talking about the 19th century history. And most importantly, so the topic is not just simply restricted to Madras presidency or South India, but I also would be talking something about how this idea of common sense of Thomas Paine created huge impact in Bengal presidency also. For example, there was a newspaper in the 1880s in Madras presidency called The Thinker. So The Thinker always used to have articles of free thinkers from Charles Bradlaugh and others. And this thinker had series of articles written by some of the Western free thinkers, and most notably a person from Calcutta who often identified himself as a Calcutta skeptic. Uh, and he used to write articles on Thomas Paine in The Thinker. For example, he was critical about theosophical movement in Madras Presidency during that time. And therefore, it is not just a history of Madras Presidency where individuals were influenced, and we also see there were individuals who were influenced by the ideas of Thomas Paine elsewhere. And commenting on the ideas of Thomas Paine, this particular Calcutta skeptic would often say that the only tool for any free thinker is common sense. Any powerful tool to challenge the authority in the established customs and the social hierarchy and the dominant was common sense. And similarly, influenced heavily by the idea of common choice of Thomas Paine, you always find Anglo vernacular newspapers in India started using the idea of common sense. For example, the newspapers like Bande Mataram, Maratha, Sudeshamitra, Hindu Patriot, daily newspapers from Calcutta continue to carry articles to indicate how nationalists like Lala Lajpat Rai, Bal Gangadhar Tilak, Bipan Chandra Paul, Aravind Ghosh, VOC, and others were influenced heavily by what these newspapers would call common sense. So therefore, you see the range of individuals or scholars uh, from various places and during various times started using common sense as a tool or as an ideology or as something to counter the dominance of various established authorities or customs, including caste system or Brahminism. Um, it is in this context we need to know how Madras presidency, for example, played a very important role in creating a kind of different place which is from different from other provinces in India. To quote Thomas Paine, "The world is my country, all mankind are my brothers, and to do good is my religion." See, if you analyze this particular statement very carefully, you always find that how this was interpreted, reinterpreted, rearticulated by various individuals in India, and particularly in Madras presidency in the second half of the 19th century, to challenge traditional religious dogmas, uh, and particularly to promote the idea of reason. And I will be talking much about the Thinker of Madras. Thinker of Madras was a journal, a weekly in English, and this was published from 1882 to 1888, 1890, just for uh, 10 or 15 years. And within these years, it created a huge impact. So this newspaper is available at the Prime Minister Museum and Library, earlier Memorial Museum and Library. So for those who are interested to explore this, please visit PML. And the thinker, therefore, played a very important role in popularizing the ideas of Thomas Paine. For example, the thinker started in the 1882s And during that particular time, Madras was often going through a different political and cultural climate. For example, theosophy was very powerful in reviving the cultural spirit of India. And in this time, the age of reason was always applied, and common sense was reinterpreted. And most importantly, the nationalists also started employing the idea of common sense in one way or the other to challenge the established customs. Now, the specific question that I would be interested is what is the impact it created in India, politically or socially or intellectually? For example, uh, if you read the common sense, you'll find the name India occurs twice. One is at one place, he says that he talks about ancient Indians, how ancient India was lacking what he would call martial matters. The second time he uses India in a different context, saying that those who hunt the woods for prey, the naked and the untutored Indian, is less savage than the king of Pradip. This he clearly tells about how colonialism and colonized will always need to be discussed within the power dynamic. Now the question comes: who introduced the ideas of Thomas Paine? Whether this idea started influencing the Indians by the Britishers or by Indians themselves? This is a very critical question that we have to ask. And in my recent research, I find that one of the very important individuals who was very keen in popularizing the idea was someone from Bengal, and his name is Kedarnath Basu. Kedarnath Basu. So Kedarnath Basu, in fact, played a very important role as an editor of a journal called Universe in Calcutta, and he also used to be a regular columnist for the Madras Thinker, the thinker from Madras, which I have discussed. And he was the one who used to write articles, particularly on Thomas Paine. And for example, the title is Thomas Paine, the apostle of political and religious liberty. And for example, he was the editor, as I already told you, a journal called Universe, which sought to disseminate the ideas of free thinkers worldwide. This is also 1880. This journal was published in 1880. And he has organized the free thought movement in Bengal in the 1880s. Particularly, his idea was to challenge missionaries and their idea of proselytizing. Conversion was rampant in Bengal during the second half of the 19th century, and he used to write letters and articles and used to appeal to the readers of the thinker from Madras to question missionaries, Christianity, and the colonial politics. And Kedarnath Basu was also a manager of liberal library in Berhampur, Bengal. So those of you near Berhampur maybe think of exploring this library, whether it's still there. I'm thinking of visiting this Berhampur when I come to Bengal next, because it seems to be very interesting individual, because not as a free thinker, but as an intellectual who was keen on influencing the society. Cutting across caste, religion, region, language, and so on and so forth. And most importantly, he sold copies published by American Free Thought Association. The books include Bennett's The God of Religions of Ancient and Modern Times, Revelations of Antichrist, and Short History of the Bible, When and What, and Critiques of Missionaries. So this is very important because as a free thinker, Kedarnath Basu was able to show his earnestness or keenness rather in spreading free thought. He sent a number of free thought pamphlets to Madras, to be displayed in the Madras Square in the 1880s. How did he get such a large number of pamphlets of free thought, of free thinkers from Western countries, Europe and America? And this is very interesting to note that he was one of the free thinkers in Bengal who was able to translate a book written by John Remsburg. John Remsburg was the author of a book uh, called Glassbreaker. So, Glassbreaker is actually a collection of free thinking pamphlets. And it was Kedarnath Basu who translated it into Bangla. I'm still looking for it, Bangla. Maybe those who are able to find out the Bangla version of Glassbreaker or Image Breaker, sorry, Image Breaker. Maybe you can get me a copy of it. Image Breaker in Bangla. So Kedarnath Basu therefore depicted Remsburg, the author of Image Breaker, as Thomas Paine of his time. Thomas Paine of his time. And I quote Kedarnath Basu. He said, I will do all I can do to bring the works of friend Remsburg to the notice of my country and will advertise them in my journal, which is Universe, free of cost, and will publish an Indian edition of them if Remsburg will not take any objection to my doing. So this clearly tells us that it was not the foreigners who were keen on disseminating, exploring, or expanding the ideas of Thomas Paine. It was Indians to begin with, played a very important role in reinterpreting or re-articulating the ideas of Thomas Paine. And most notably, Kedarnath Basu could not be ignored. And similarly, we also need to know another important individual who was influenced by Thomas Paine's work was Jyotira Phule, because he was keen on using Thomas Paine's ideas, particularly the rights of man, and tried to incorporate his ideas into his own social reform work. And third, the most notable person who was keen on introducing the ideas of Thomas Paine was Annie Besant, a prominent figure we all know in both traditional Indian social and political movements. And she would call Thomas Paine as with a grand title, and she would go to the extent to identify him as a world hero. And she placed him alongside other thinkers like Copernicus, Voltaire, and so on and so forth. So it's very important, therefore, to see how Annie Besant had an admiration for Paine, Thomas Paine, that stemmed from his rationalist and humanist ideas. which we know from various sources, continue to resonate with their own views on social reform and religious critique. And if you look at the history of the 20th century, you also notice that Mahatma Gandhi spoke of the ideas of Thomas Paine in his Hind Swaraj. And similarly, Jawaharlal Nehru continued to refer to the ideas of Thomas Paine in his speeches, letters, and writings. You know, how Thomas Paine needs to be remembered for political liberty, right from his influence on American Revolution. To be more specific, why colonial South India became a center of philosophical inquiry in the second half of the 19th century. So my primary concern here is, of course, we need to see this from a holistic perspective, but from my understanding, I have an unshakable conviction that any discussion on the discourse of social and religious liberty in Madras Press would make little sense without adequately referencing the role played by Annie Besant, Theosophy, the Theosophical Society, and other important section popularly known as the Hindu Free Thinkers Union, Hindu Free Thinkers Union, and the weekly newspaper, The Thinker, and another Anglo vernacular newspaper, Tattva Vivesani. In English, it is called, or translated rather, Philosophic Inquiry. Now, the most important aspect is what is the significance of the newspaper called The Thinker? The Thinker, as I already told you, played a very important role. It continued to carry articles of free thinkers worldwide, particularly in Europe and America. And it also used to carry articles of Indians, and most notably Kedarnath Basu from Bengal. And the core value which the thinker used to demonstrate or sought to demonstrate was under the patronage of Hindu Free Thought Union. A Hindu Free Thought Union. So this particular newspaper functioned under the patronage of the Free or Hindu Free Thought Union, and it was often claiming that it was a crusade against superstition, custom, poverty, and prostitution. And the thinker continued to emphasize the need for reason. And it said, I quote, he who dares not reason is a bigot. He who cannot is a fool. And he who will not is a slave. Unquote. So the thinker clearly tells us how it was keen on projecting itself as the only secular journal in India. That's very important to know. You always find this in the journal. Only secular journal in India. And it sought to examine all religions of the world with a view to find out their truths and expose their absurdities. And it was trying to be bold, untrammeled opponent of what is often called superstitions. For example, it was to confront the ideas of philosophical society that sought to fight ancient superstition. That's what it called, not my word, and exploded errors. And it was an inveterate foe of custom. This is another claim the thinker of Madras used to make. The stagnation of the human intellect. Similarly, it sought to root out poverty because it claimed poverty was the source of all crime. And it raised its voice against prostitution, particularly what is called temple prostitution. It sought to uphold the liberty, physical and mental. And this clearly tells us how it continued to advocate or claims to have advocated for devoting to the dissemination of the views of moderate thinkers on social, moral, religious, and scientific objects. Now, the question comes whether Madras presidency was the first one to witness such free thinking movement or elsewhere. Also, there was such movement. For example, even before Madras became the center of free thinking in the last decades of the 19th century, I'm sure you all agree with me. The free thinkers in Bengal, under the broader umbrella called the Young Bengal Movement, radical intellectuals from Hindu Calcutta, in the first half of the 19th, under the able leadership of Henry Desrosiers, often the followers of Desrosiers called themselves Desrosiers, emphasized reason, rational inquiry, challenging social norms and religious dogma. So therefore, I am not making any sweeping generalization here that Madras presidency was the earliest presidency to witness any free thinking movement. Bengal already witnessed it. And another important reason why this free thinkers movement in Madras, to be more specific, Hindu free thinkers. So the Hindu free thinkers were keen on advocating the ideas of secularism and rationalism, because it was the time when we all know this term called secularism was coined in 1850s. George Jacob Holton. And since then, secularism also became a point of discussion worldwide. Secular society, secular union, free thinkers movement, and rationalism. All these ideas were used interchangeably to create changes in the society. Question the established authority, customs, norms of the society, hierarchy in the society, inequality in the society, slavery, and so on and so forth. And similarly, the Hindu freethinkers were often found to have been inspired by London-based anti-church movement, which was, of course, founded in London. And the Free Hindu Thought, the Hindu Free Thought Union, later identified itself Madras Secular Systems. So please remember, these ideas were used interchange. So secularist society, free Hindu Free Thought Union, free thinking society, and Madras Secular Society. And this is very interesting. If you ask me, who are these free thinkers? Can we name them? In most of the cases, except Kedarnath Basu, you have his name or some foreign writer. And most of the cases, the writings were absolutely anonymous, but sometimes pseudo names. For example, most of the writings would have you know, names like a positivist, a philanthropist, Excelsior, a friend of India, a neo Malthusian, a Calcutta skeptic, to name a few. So you don't find, therefore, who is writing what. We all know the exact reason why such practice happened in Madras, because the colonial government was keen on uh, in identifying such seditious pamphlets in case if they are able to find the names, and they would obviously will be sent back to their respective motherlands. And therefore, most of the writings, maybe writings by Annie Besant and others, you find hardly their names mentioned. So most of them anonymously mentioned. And it is, for example, Annie Besant's role needs to be understood very critically and historically, because the Hindu freethinkers sought to popularize their ideas through the writings of Annie Besant. For example, Annie Besant's writings, My Path to Atheism, Gospel of Atheism, Liberty, Equality, Fraternity, Christian Religion, Oration on the Guards, Some Mistakes of Moses, Science and Religion, Futility of Prayer, Bible Romances. So all these writings of Annie Besant, you find in the advertising columns of the Madras Thinker. And similarly, Kedarnath Basu also used to advertise what are the books he has bought from America or England. And he also has a library, liberal library, and he used to share the copies, and he used to appeal the Madras Thinker to translate. Now, this is very important, therefore, uh, the role played by Kedarnath Basu, Annie Besant, and Charles Brodner and others, and all the articles written by anonymous authors continue to shape the intellectual landscape. That's very important. For example, what are the themes you find in the Thinker of Madras? Uh, Focus mostly on Western thinkers. For example, it included articles of European thinkers like Thomas Paine, Spinoza, Voltaire, Ingersoll. And the discourse of liberty was influenced heavily by the London based anti church movement led by Charles Brodler. And it was keen on critiquing the ideas and ideals of theosophy. So, if you ask me what was the major contending force that the Hindu freethinkers confronted with, it was theosophy. So theosophy was actually the driving force behind the emergence of the Hindu freethinkers. Why the freethinkers had to be critical about theosophy? That's a very important question that we have to ask. Because Madras presidency, you always find uh, various ideas, particularly revival of Hinduism and Brahminism, for example. These are the ideas Thinker was talking about. And therefore, the Thinker weekly was very much against what is called Brahminism. For example, the publication challenged religious beliefs and practices, advocating for a more rational and secular world. And very interestingly, you find free thinkers from England were part of the Madras Hindu Free Thinkers Association. Joseph Syme. Joseph Syme from England or was the secularist and the publicist was the patron of the Hindu free thought youth. And similarly, he used to organize, Kedarnath Basu used to organize lectures on Brahmanism, anti-theosophism, atheism, casteism, prostitution, and missionary. Um, Most interesting aspect of this discussion is the thinker used to rely extensively on the London-based free thinkers. London-based free thinkers is another important journal of free thinkers from London. So I find therefore there's a close connection between the thinker of Madras and the free thinker of London. The free thinker of London often used to applaud, the role played by the thinker of Madras, saying that the thinker of Madras is an excellent little paper and most daringly outspoken. And it used to convey its regard to come out with more ideas and more in strength against all the attacks of its enemies. So, who are these enemies of the free thinkers? Most importantly, the people who were defenders of theosophy. Theosophy was perhaps a very predominant contending force that used to challenge free thinkers, and free thinkers in turn used to challenge ideas and ideas of, theosophy. An interesting aspect of this particular discussion is whether the thinker spoke anything directly about Thomas Paine. Yes, it is. For example, the thinker of Madras often used to portray Thomas Paine in its editorial pages as he was the real father of the great American Republic and did as much for the welfare of the people of France, England, as any other nation. The thinker also used to say that Thomas Paine was, in every sense, a great and noble man. Yet, for nearly a century, the church has endeavored to cover his name with infamy. And therefore, it appealed to its readers to read, reread, interpret, and critically examine the ideas of Thomas Paine. This is how Thomas Paine becomes relevant in Madras present. Now, I would like to discuss few things, particular as a case study. Then I'll stop. Maybe I'll be interested to have questions. How did the free thinkers, in the name of Hindu free thinker union? So remember, it is the Hindu free thinkers. Now the question comes whether free thinkers can be Hindus or free thinkers can be Christians. That's a very controversial category of free thinkers. Hindu free thinkers union were able to articulate their ideas of social and religious liberty, largely influenced by the free thinkers in London and America. For example, most of the works of thinkers published were writings of European and American free thinkers. The thinker was keen on promoting and popularizing these ideas through translations and publications. As I told you, Kedarnath Basu is a classic example in buying books from various free thinkers worldwide and sending them to Madras to be sold or to be translated or to be displayed in the Madras literature fairs, the second half of the 15th century. For example, the free thinkers used the thinker as a platform to carry advertisements with a caption "Free Thought Books for Sale." You find every week this advertisement almost becomes inevitable. For example, free thought books for sale. So, what are the books you find in the free thought? For example, books like Eminent Radicals in and Out of Parliament, England, Elements of Social Science, National Secular Societies, History and Philosophy of Civilization by Allison, and even Thomas Paine's photo was at display. That says a lot about how the thinker and the Hindu Madras uh, Free Thinkers Union keen on promoting Thomas Paine's ideas. For example, we also find Thomas Paine's photo, as I already told you. Charles Brodlaw's book, Is It Reasonable to Worship God? When Were Our Gospels Written? Christian Theism Teach, Annie Besant's Free Thinkers textbook, My Path to Atheism. So these are some of the books. And every week, or sometimes every month, you find new books that were advertised in the Thinker of Marx. Now, the free thinkers continue to express their discontent. How and why various factors that were leading to India to fall from its glory. For example, there used to be articles on fall of India. Why? And the author is either a friend of India or Excelsior or a positivist. We do not know exactly who has written, but the Indian or a foreigner. That's very debatable. For example, one of the articles, Fall of India, you find the articles, this particular article was challenging child marriage. Some of the articles used to challenge prostitution. Some of the articles used to challenge Brahmanism. And similarly, you find articles challenging theosophy. So, commenting on the child marriage in Hindu society, the article would say that the enlightened, educated Indian masses should awake to reform Hindu society. And for example, it became a constant discussion was to remove the conservative ideas and to promote liberal section. For example, it used to quote Ram Mohan Roy in these articles, Hindu reformer, quoting Ram Mohan Roy that he was a Hindu reformer, that he graced the pages of Indian history, but were grappling with the momentous question on child marriage. For example, despite ceaseless condemnations of the child marriages, the thinker used to question the masses, how they were not able to create any major change in the Indian society. The question that the article would raise is, why have we not seen and hear of young babies of both sexes married together with the grave advice of crafty priests? Second question is, have we not heard of young girl of 5 or 8 being forced by parents to become the better half of a male of very old age? Have we not heard of 1,000 cases of domestic discord and ruin in Hindu families at large? So these are the questions that the thinker used to ask. And definitely you find uh, as a result of such critical questions, the Hindu free thinkers now have come to a conclusion that Madras became the stronghold of superstition. Why Madras became a stronghold of superstition? Largely, they identified that it is because of the presence of theosophy, theosophical society. For example, superstitions and weak brained people from different parts of India met together at Madras to pay homage and adoration to that American Rishi. Who is American Rishi here? Colonel Henry Alcott. He was the founding president of the Theosophical Society in India. So he was portrayed as American Rishi. And this Madras thinker always used to question the very presence of American Rishi, Colonel Alcott, who promised universal brotherhood. And the ways in which the thinker used to challenge sometimes, used to intrigue students of history like me. For example, according to the Hindu free thinkers, theosophy aimed at universal brotherhood, but it was not working on a wrong basis. It was working on a wrong base. It asked, the question is very intriguing, can theosophy establish brotherhood between a Brahmin and a pariah? No, it cannot. It is utterly impossible to establish brotherhood and one nationality in India as long as theosophy encourages the division of caste and various other superstitions, as well as absurd religions. This is how the Hindu freethinkers, under the broader umbrella of the English weekly called The Thinkers, used to challenge theosophy in Madras presently. Secondly, the freethinkers were keen on exploring new ideas, maybe new alternatives to the continuous uh, social hierarchy. For example, it used to be very critical of Brahminism. Now it is the Hindu freethinkers, again anonymous. You cannot name them. Okay, therefore it is debatable. And the Hindu freethinkers claimed that ancient times when the Brahmins were the only civilized and learned class in India, they organized a code of laws to benefit themselves and to oppress the ignorant and the illiterate who were known as Sudras. The code of laws, according to the Hindu freethinkers, that were formed by them were such as to keep the Sudras always perpetual poverty and slavery, and Brahmins in perpetual prosperity and power. Unquote. So this is some of the very important critical observations made by the Hindu thinkers about Hinduism, particularly Brahmins. If you keep reading some of the articles, you will find that in those ancient times, when ignorance reigned in India, the cunning Brahmin priests had instructed the ignorant Sudras that he must give as charity to Brahmins, all that is precious, so that the Sudra might enjoy bliss after death in heaven. In return for all the happiness he conferred on the Brahmin during his life on this terrestrial globe. So I have a long list of the observations, particularly critical observations made by the Hindu free thinkers against Brahmins and Brahmanism as an ideology. And similarly, the Hindu free thinkers, as I already told you, were critical of what they would call prostitution. This is another discourse of liberty, social liberty, which they called. The Hindu free thinkers were critical of prostitution in India, and they argued that the Hindu religion was the great encourager of prostitution. It's a very critical and serious and strongly worded statement. And the Hindu free thinkers say every temple which dedicated to Shiva, Vishnu, had a number of dasis or prostitutes attached to it. Any procession of the idol of the Hindu gods was considered incomplete without a staff of these dancing prostitutes who always used to go as an advance guard to the idol. The bulk of the religious procession was formed by a large number of what it called vagabonds and abandoned youths that surrounded the advanced god of prostitutes. It has gone to the extent to say that it was the religious piety to this idol that attracted such large crowds of people that generally followed the Hindu religious processions. But the center of attraction, according to the Hindu free thinkers, lied in the female beauties that go in advance of the idol. Half the money allotted to the Hindu temples goes to feed and enrich these temple prostitutes. This is another claim made by the Hindu free thinkers published in the Thinker of Madras. And it was a great pity, according to the Hindu free thinkers, to see that money of the masses earned by the sweat of their brow in the scorching tropical sun of Madras was thus wasted upon the prostitutes who brought misery on thousands of youth by propagating syphilis without any restraint. And you find there is a kind of scientific reason. It's not that the Hindu Free Thought Union was against prostitution, but they seem to have suggested a scientific reason. If you are interested, I can share this scientific reason as explained by the Hindu free thinker. It says the common prostitute of Madras was subject to the Contagious Disease Act and thus comes under the supervision of a health officer who takes care that an infected woman does not haunt the thoroughfares and thus keeps her in lock hospital until she is thoroughly cured of her syphilis. So, according to these Hindu free thinkers, it was not the case with the temple prostitute who avoids the inspection of the health officer under the false cloak of religion. There comes religion, attack on religion. How the prostitutes, the supposedly prostitutes, were using religion as a safety wall mechanism to keep themselves away from any state sponsored inspection. So this, according to these thinkers, was a dangerous policy of the government. Now the free thinkers were keen on challenging the government, which, according to them, was shielding such prostitutes. And the free thinkers asked, has not the government put a stop to the custom of sati and other human sacrifices, although they were connected with the Hindu religion? Why not our parental government, the British government, which clearly says the writer may not be an Indian? Why not our parental government keep them under the same restrictions and rules as are applicable to the common prostitutes? If at all, taints the institution of laboring classes, but a temple prostitute is sure to taint the rising intellectuals of India and the rising generation of India, be thus civilized and murdered by these prostitutes who, under the cover of damnable religious, escape the Contagious Disease Act. Imagine what will happen to the Hindu nation. I see this word repeatedly, Hindu nation. So here comes the question: Hindu Free Thought Union, Hindu free thinkers, how they were critical about prostitution and why the government was, in a way, allowing, was not acceptable by these Hindu free thinkers. Now, another important point which I would like to emphasize: how and why the free thinkers were against Christianity and the missionaries in particular. For example, according to the thinkers, the missionaries not only vilified the Hindu religion, but also challenged those who advocated the ideas of greed, skepticism, materialism, and atheism. Well, if you read some of the articles that were published in the Thinker of Madras, you find how the Hindu free thinkers commented how Hindus were often forced to yield to Christianity, a religion that is opposed in its doctrines to science and common sense. Here comes the question of common sense. The common sense as an idea, common sense as a tool, common sense as a potential methodology to challenge Christianity and missionary politics, as if Christianity and missionaries were completely free from common sense. So hundreds of contradictory inconceivables. This is what the free thinkers would call about, filled with, missionaries. Missionaries were filled with the contradictory conceivables of the Bible, appear to Hindus more misty and absurd than those of their own religion. So here comes a kind of comparison between Hinduism and Christianity. And therefore, Christianity was criticized for a number of reasons, among other things. It is very interesting to note the Hindu free thinkers were of the view that the missionary effort to put down the Hindu religion had been useless. With all their leaflet circulation, street preaching, or rather street babbling, well supported, although not well intentioned, dailies, weekly journals, and magazines, salvationizing armies, or more properly excited brands of religious fanatics. The Christian missionaries in India had affected their cause materially very little, if at all. Indeed, the laborers were too many for the limited harvest they gathered. This is how they challenged the missionary discourse and the biblical thought. The harvest is plenty and the laborers are few. But the Hindu free thinkers would contradict the missionaries that they were not able to make any impact in terms of their conversion ideology. Rather, they were able to create only a limited harvest, which means limited soul harvest. And now the question is, it has its own limitation. The free thinkers had its own limitation. So, due to time constraint, I will take 2 minutes to conclude. And of course, as I have already discussed, the free thinkers, particularly the Hindu Free Thinkers Union, or in other words, Madras Secular Society, Kedarnath Basu in particular, and other anonymous authors who were keen on popularizing the ideas of Thomas Paine, particularly his Rights of Man, Age of Reason, the Common Sense. It had its own limitations. For example, the journalist, as I already pointed out, the thinker was able to survive only for a brief period. The major reason for its inability to survive beyond the stipulated time was it was lacking patronage. For example, Dr. Arastu recently published some of the articles from Freethinkers that published from 1880 to 1888. He says the journal was associated with the radical thinkers of the Madras Secular Society, but it is unfortunate that the journal was not able to continue for a longer time because it disappeared for want of patronage. This is one of the serious limitations of this Hindu freethinkers movement or the freethinkers movement. The second important challenge which I find is most of the freethinkers from Europe or America were hardly interested in the political liberation. And the discourse of political liberty seemed to have been literally missing. For example, if you read Charles Pradip, who delivered a lecture at Leeds branch of the National Secular Society, his subject of discussion was our Indian empire, how we came there, how we govern it, and how we ought to govern. I repeat, this is very important. The speech or the speeches delivered by Broadman, among other things, he was not keen on addressing colonialism or imperialism or the colonial authority or exploitative nature of the imperialistic British, because most of his talk at least in the discussion took place in National Secular Society, was in a way trying to support colonialism, if I understand it correctly. Otherwise, he should have questioned through his free thinking that a country ruling another country, how far it can be justified. So the topic, most importantly, seems to suggest our Indian empire, how we came there, how we govern it, how we ought to govern it, seems to suggest, at least to me, that he was not keen or rather interested to discuss colonialism or oppression of British over India. And another important challenge of the free thinking group was the thinker of Madras always used to advocate the idea that its readers should be ashamed to talk of politics. So this I don't understand why the free thinkers were not keen on addressing political issues, because political issues seem to be very, very relevant, at least in the second half of the 19th century. And the reason and the justification also given by the free thinkers. For example, according to the free thinkers, every free thinker should have three qualities. One is a common sense for inquiry. Second is a common sense for strict observance of the moral law. And third, a common sense for exploring the truth. So these are considered to be the qualification for any free thinker in Madras. So there was an article on this. So who are the free thinkers and who should be and who can be the free thinker? So these are the primary qualities. Common sense for inquiry and strict observance of moral law and common sense for exploring the truth. Now, the most unfortunate, I'm using unfortunate here largely because how the European and American thinkers were critical of the Indian free thinkers. Why I'm saying so here is because if you read the Thinker of Madras, you find it says very clearly one could not be or one cannot be a free thinker without these three qualities. Hence, the thinker of Madras often portrayed Madras free thinkers as pseudo free thinkers. Now you, you can understand how free thinkers of the West were able to create narratives or discourses on social, on religious liberty, but they were not able to keep themselves completely free from undermining the capability of Indians to become free thinkers. Because for them, Indians can never go beyond their limit where they would not be able to have a common sense for inquiry, strict observance of the moral law, and law of common sense for exploring the truth. So here comes a concluding remarks. So as a student of history, I don't want to make any sweeping generalization. I want to always be a free thinker in terms of exploring and examining the idea without mincing words. So my concluding remarks, therefore, is, of course, we cannot make a sweeping generalization that this played a very, very interesting role without any limitation. Of course, it has its own limitation. So, despite limitation, the principles maintained in common sense and principle maintained in the common sense, I'm not only including Thomas Paine, but also common sense as an idea, common sense as a tool, common sense as a methodology, common sense as an ideology continues to be relevant to all mankind because they should be carefully studied, examined, or rather re examined by everyone who is at all desirous to possess that information without which he must ever remain a slave at heart. And my final concluding remark is owing to the efforts of Hindu free thinkers, what was the impact it created? For example, superstition This is also another claim made by the Hindu freethinkers that superstition was slowly but surely retreating or declining. And the freethinkers also claimed that they undertook the most responsible duty of dispelling the clouds of superstition and letting the clear sunlight of truth shed its radiance and splendor over the length and breadth of the country. And they were warring against idolatry, which they called the degradation of humanity. And they were expressing their discontent about the very idea of prostitution, which later was abolished, not simply as a result of the free thinking, but free thinkers played a very important. And they were warring against the supremacy of the Vedas and the unjust prerogatives of Brahma. These were the words explained in the thinker. And they were warring against all kinds of superstitions, old and new, ancient and modern. They claimed that superstition was gradually given away. But there's an alarming. They expressed their discontent that it had then gained strength in the person of the theosophical leaders. But still, they were critical about theosophy for creating the possibilities of a kind of revival of such superstitions, which the free thinkers wanted to challenge. So, under the name of theosophy, the thinkers added the whole of the ancient superstitions of India had raised up its head. On this, the Hindu freethinker said, I quote, our reply must be prompt and speedy. We must crush the devil called superstition. Now, this is some of my observations. And these observations, in fact, are debatable. If you have any counter viewpoints. And secondly, this I have not published yet. Otherwise, I would have shared a copy of this. It's in the way, in the making of the publication. And therefore, I would suggest if you need any information on the free thinkers, the thinker of Madras, I would be happy to share my thoughts at all times. Thank you so much, Prof. Pradip. I will be happy to have questions.
Thank you very much, Professor Doss, for your enlightening discussion. Now, Prakash, if you have received any questions, please display. Prakash, in the meantime, can I put a few questions of my own?
Sure.
Professor Doss, you are saying Hindu freethinkers. Is it not a contradiction in terms? Because Thomas Paine did not prefer any particular religion, and his writings were against religion, particularly Christianity, etc., etc., different churches. So, how can a free thinker inspired by the ideas of Thomas Paine can at the same time claim to be a Hindu? Or do they, do they, did they claim themselves to be Hindu free thinkers? Or it is a description you are putting upon them? Kindly clarify. Then I will
Sure.
come to my next question.
So thank you, Professor Basu. I think I have not used even not changed any full stop or comma. And this is exactly the weekly newspaper on the first page of every publication uh, displays that this particular newspaper is under the patronage of Hindu Free Thought Union. And subsequently, you find the Hindu free thinkers in most of the articles. So therefore, I quote, in invited commas. It's not my word at all. And that's why in the beginning also I was critical about how a free thinker can be a Hindu or a Christian or any religion identity. And therefore, definitely I am critical of this particular. My assumption here is this particular idea called free thinkers, Hindu free thinkers, could perhaps be used to challenge the theosophical society. Because theosophical society mostly had followers from Brahmins and some section of non-Brahmins. And how do you confront them? You cannot simply use free thinkers. People would simply reject. Oh, it is an imported ideology, and therefore they should be condemned, and they should be deported from India. And this perhaps could be one of the reasons why they have strategically come out with this particular term called Hindu Free Thinkers Union. Of course, this paper was under the patronage. Now, what happened? Because the Hindu free thinkers in 1888, 1899 may not have extended its patronage, and the newspaper seemed to have disappeared. And this raises a series of questions. And so far in my research, I have not found even a single person who openly identifies that he is a Hindu free thinker. And therefore, it is debatable. Thank you for asking this question.
Thank you very much. Actually, that means that they were not aware of the self contradiction.
Yes, definitely.
Probably that. Acha, secondly, do you would you like to include Raja Rammohan Roy in this group of category of free thinkers?
Yes, because you find, I don't exactly remember, Ramon Roy seems to have been influenced by some of the ideas of Thomas Paine.
Yes.
For example, in terms of reasoning, and this is a time when Western education was given much importance. In Bengal presidency, he itself was a strong supporter of English education, and some of the critical initiatives made by Brahma Samaj here in Bengal presidency, and some of the important initiatives made by some Dalit leaders in Bombay presidency, for example, in terms of education, also were attracted by the ideas of Ram Mohan Roy and Thomas Paine. For example, Ram Mohan Roy's ideas seem to have suggested that the Hindu society or the rationalism or the established custom. The one particular idea that I have used, Ram Mohan Rai also, I think, seems to have suggested certain cursed customs. Cursed customs. I think Sadi also could have been under this category of cursed, the custom that was cursed, and you are imposing it, and therefore you should be able to critically, um, by using not necessarily common sense, but the age of reason or the rights of man, and so on and so forth. Yes, and it is very much relevant. I have not done much research on this, but I have come across that how he was influenced um by Thomas Paine. I,
And out of my
and one
curiosity,
thing I have added,
huh, yeah,
I would like to add. I think
please.
I don't know who said it exactly, but Ram Mohan Roy uh, was often quoted by the Hindu free thinker. And one of the articles which I find in the free thinker was how Ram Mohan Roy was able to grace the pages of Indian history that was grappling with numerous questions on child marriage. So there they have acknowledged, the Hindu free thinkers acknowledged the contribution of uh, Ram Mohan Roy. For example, despite ceaseless condemnations of child marriages, the masses seem to have been addicted to it with the fond affection. And it was Ram Mohan Roy, through his critical reasoning, was able to challenge. So there you have a clearly recorded statement. And this was actually published the 30th December 1883. The 30th is also the article published in the Madras Thinker with the title Fall of India Why. And this also has a anonymous name. We don't have any person who wrote it. The person who identified himself or herself is Excelsior. Sometimes you find a friend of India, a positivist, and similarly the story goes. So therefore, we don't get exact picture who was actually the person, and this is therefore a very complex, uh, you know, in terms of authorship of particular articles. Yes, of course, the name of Ram Mohan Rai is very much there in the thinkers of Madras.
Thank you. Another question is coming to my mind that in South India, a large number of Muslims and Christians also lived together with the Hindus, and Thomas Paine's writings and ideas, did these inspire also some Muslims and Christians in South India?
But this is something which I have not come across much. But throughout the writings, the articles that were published in the Thinker and the Tamil Wiki, which was translated as Philosophic Inquirer, I have not come across even one article, single article about Thomas Paine's writings on Muslims And most of the writings of the free thinkers, I'm not talking about how it was directly responsible directly impacting religious community, in this case Christians. But one thing is very clear: he seems to have suggested a Christian idea of unity in this particular pamphlet called Common Sense. You find he seemed to have suggested a Christian union, and that should be used as a metaphor to create unity among all sections of the society. On the other side, he was very critical about the clergy, about the exploitation in the church, and he was not completely against any particular religion and its dogma, particularly Christianity. So I think it's very difficult to say that Christians in South India or Muslims in South India. But to be very frank, I was not able to find even a single article, a single writing about Muslims. And there were a number of articles on Christianity and missionary politics. For example, Kedarnath Basu used to invite individuals, particularly free thinkers from Europe. I'm still looking for whether Charles Brodler was able to make speeches in Bengal. I think there's
And
some discussion.
yeah, yeah.
Similarly, the idea that I was talking about is the missionary politics. Kedarnath Basu was keen on challenging missionary, not in defense of Christianity or missionary. And he used to spend a number of pamphlets, as I already discussed. There's a collection of pamphlets. This image breaker was, I don't know whether it was translated in Bangla, but I would be happy to have a copy from you if you have a Bangla version of the image breaker. Of course, it is there in English. Maybe you can think of exploring it and share the copies to among your students and scholars. That would be a very very interesting thing to do, because he used to contribute money and he used to send a number of such pamphlets to Madras, challenging and criticizing missionaries and the missionary politics, Christianity, and the claims of Christianity. But I have not come across even one instance where such pamphlets are talking about Muslims. I don't know why and how this is missing. So still it's a matter to be explored.
And finally, uh, you have made a very interesting point that these free thinkers were not going to raise the questions of political liberty. And we know that Thomas Paine, he was not talking only about social freedom, but he particularly uh, gave attention to political liberty uh, in a very wide sense, political liberty in multiple variations, right to freedom of expression, right to vote. Uh, Even when some people argued that only propertied citizens can give votes, Thomas Paine objected to that, and he said that no, property or not, whatever, mm, they they should have the right to vote, and he supported revolutions, uh, the American independence, uh, and French Revolution. So largely, his concept of liberty was moving around politics. Uh, but the way you describe the Hindu free thinkers, they were not very much interested to put it in the political context. Uh, could you please explain it a little more elaborately? I find it very interesting, your point. But how could this happen? When Thomas Paine was mainly talking about political liberty, these followers who had been influenced by the ideas of Thomas Paine, particularly common sense and also age of reason, or say rights of man, etc., which were very much influential. Uh, but all of these certainly gave much emphasis on political liberty, and why these people avoid the political question. Was it because they were politically not very conscious, or they were afraid of the British persecution, or social ostracism? Particularly, you see, you were talking about 1880s. In 1885, the Congress, Indian National Congress, was formed, and there were leaders like Dadabhai Naoroji, S.N. Banerjee, W.C. Banerjee, uh, Firoz Shah Mehta, Gokhale, etc. So the how this kind of paradox could take place. If you kindly please, I'll explain it a little more.
So I think you have beautifully summarized within this question the possibilities. Why the so-called free thinkers? I'm using so-called because the Madras free thinkers were never seen as genuine free thinkers. They were known as pseudo free thinkers. It raises a series of questions. For the British and American free thinkers, they were genuine free thinkers because they were the ones who were capable, perhaps, of following what they would call three qualities, which I have emphasized. One is a common sense for inquiry, a common sense for strict observance of moral law, which is not of religious in nature, but the society and the civilization has been following for ages. So that is really was not clear in terms of the explaining aspect. Because in India, it can be interpreted differently. Moral law is always Manu law, or maybe any other law that religious communities have come up with. And therefore, the third important quality is, according to them, is a common sense for exploring the truth. So the British and American free thinkers, again, I am quoting the article. I am suspecting that this article, particularly titled "Who Could Be Free Thinkers," may not have been written exactly by an Indian or any Indian. So this is very important because the free thinkers in Madras were completely lacking these three qualities, and therefore the Madras free thinkers were depicted as pseudo free thinkers. I'm just giving it as a background to your question. So this needs to be understood first. why they were not critical about politics. Because for me, they seem to have been part of this political process in one way or the other. For example, Charles Bradlaugh, in his speeches in London, he would openly say why we as Britishers went to India, how we governed them, and how we ought to govern. This summarizes clearly what is actually the political state, despite the fact that they were very much aware of the political situation in India and the possible excommunication from India the moment they talk about, because many missionaries, I'm talking about the 20th century, who had used the flag of Congress and they had established societies in support of Congress and Gandhi, were excommunicated. This is the later part of the 20th century, 1920s, 1930s, which I have published, which I can share. But this was not the case in the second half of the 90s, because even at this time, Congress was trying to create a space for itself, perhaps nationally. And there were people like Wedderburn and Cotton and other British who were keen on creating a kind of relationship with the masses. For example, the editor of the Hindu, Subramanya Iyer, was very much in support of William Wedderburn, who was one of the president of Indian National Congress. So this is something which we need to understand very critically, how and why. Again, I am assuming we don't have any concrete evidence why they were deliberately neglecting the political aspect. I have completely agree with you that Thomas Paine cannot be, any discussion on Thomas Paine will be incomplete without discussing politics, the discourse of politics or political liberty. But in this case, most of the writings seem to have come from the British or American people, including Annie Besant. So it is clearly evident that the British and American free thinkers, for safety of their ideology and ideas, they were able to restrict themselves with the social and religious liberty. And another important reason, they clearly suggested that political liberty is not possible unless and until you have social and religious liberty. So political liberty comes therefore third. And India as a country is known for superstition, Brahminism, established norms and customs of the ancient society. It is not possible to have a political liberty. Political liberty was always seen as something which is perhaps insignificant and not something which needs to be discussed, because their larger idea was to challenge theosophy. Theosophy was not a political argument. It was a social and religious argument. It was trying to create a scenario what in North India, going back to Vedas, Arya Samaj was propagated. It is Arya Samaj of South India, almost like. So therefore, you find that they were always targeting Arya Samaj in the north, and in the south, they were keen on challenging the idea of theosophy. And they have gone to the extent to say that Colonel Alcott was, um, the one who was responsible for the revival of superstition. And therefore, political discourse on political liberty seems to have been not given much importance. Social and religious discourses were were emphasized, and whereas political discussion was not given much importance, despite the fact that common sense was centered around the larger discourse of political um, liberation. Uh,
Thank you. Actually, if we want to draw some uh, conclusions for the contemporary relevance, as you were trying to point out, I would like to add, I want to know whether you agree with that, that this kind of limitation in accepting Thomas Paine's discourse of liberty, mane, that means this incompleteness, this failure to accept the spirit of Thomas Paine, uh, this certainly has something to do with the limitations of secularism practiced in independent India, and secular character of Indian constitution, and particularly today the discourse of Hindutva. uh, this might have something to do with uh, this. It must be somehow connected. It can be established that there is some connection between these limitations of secularism and the transformation of a secular constitution into a Hindutva state, maybe in future, maybe that there is something to do with the failure of grasping the full significance of secular humanism and political liberty of Thomas Paine. Maybe that is my understanding. I don't know whether you will agree with that. Uh, but whatever you have said, that indicates this kind of a hint, a possibility. Okay. Uh, Thank you so much. Acha Prakash, uh, are there any questions? Prakash, Shomiron, disconnected. Let me call. হ্যাঁ বলছি কোশ্চেন এসছে কিনা in the meantime, Professor Christhu Dos,
yes, yes.
mm, uh, thank you so much
Not at
for
all. It's absolutely my pleasure.
working so hard, and you have given so much of your time. Really, thank you. Acha Prakash has joined.
Okay.
Prakash,
হ্যাঁ
Uh,
হ্যাঁ স্যার
Prakash,
হ্যাঁ
are there any questions?
নো স্যার নো কোয়েশ্চেন
Okay, okay. Then we can conclude here. Huh? Thank
Sure.
you very much, Professor Christhu Jose. Thank you so much for this enlightening discussion. And this recording will be uploaded in the YouTube within a few days, and I will send you the link again so that you can share it with your friends and students. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Basu.
থ্যাংক ইউ স্যার থ্যাংক ইউ সো
Thank you.